This is chapter 4. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about conservatism as an ideology, which in today's world, the Republican Party side of politics is considered the conservative side. Let's talk a little bit about some definitions first as to what conservatism is. And in general, a conservative thinking person would be one who's probably a little bit more resistant to change, of stirring up, or a little bit more resistant to stirring up what could be, new ideas, might be a little bit more deferential to traditional authority, things like that. Could also say that conservatism is to preserve something, whether that be traditional values or the way things have always been. But the debate, of course, remains over what it is that we want to preserve, and conservatism is associated with a resistance to change. So you could perhaps say that somebody who is generally, if that's their nature, that's their personality, to be a little bit more resistant to change or a little bit more preferable to the existing ways of doing things, then you could say they would be attracted to the conservative side of politics. Generally, that may be true. It's not quite that simple, because a lot of people are socialized into their political beliefs, and then that stays with them a long time, regardless of what their true nature might be. We've touched on a few things as far as where the beginnings of conservatism had originated from. Anti-communism, particularly post-World War II, was a particularly defining mark in the Western world. We've also got different shades of conservatism: the classical, traditional conservatism, where we're looking at a hierarchical type structure that is strong enough to restrain the passions of the people. So again, we're looking at more of an authoritarian type of ideology. And then the individualist conservatism, where we want to reduce government to allow for free competition of profit. So you can see that even though we have shades of conservatism here, interesting variations on what government's role is in this ideology. Conservatism initially starts out with the idea that humans are fundamentally flawed, or we're not perfect, and we cannot be governed solely by the light of reason, which is what the Age of Enlightenment was trying to advocate a little bit more. And the function of education is to limit the instincts and behavior through ethical habits. The conservative ideas are also attempting to warn against bold attempts to improve society, somewhat resistant to broad progressive changes here. That's not to say that things will happen incrementally, gradually, naturally. We've already touched on Edmund Burke just for a few minutes in the previous chapter. He would be considered the father of modern conservative thinking. His writings on the reaction to the French Revolution, which he thought was misguided, were quite influential in trying to bring back this respect for traditional authority. However, there are some common elements here to liberalism, since that is our founding philosophy. Humans are not a loose collection, but rather a society that is a living, changing organism. He referred to this as a social fabric. So as you'll see, when we talk about these ideas of Edmund Burke, a lot of ideas of what conservatism is today are not quite familiar with these original ideas. It's not necessarily a social contract that we're looking for, but a sacred covenant that ties all generations together. So Burke was actually trying to go even a little bit deeper as far as bringing civil society together. Short-sighted, self-interested humans need power of government for a civilized society. So they're going all the way back to Hobbes acknowledging that we're selfish, competitive creatures and that we have to sacrifice some of our freedom for this common power to protect us. Major commonalities here. Freedom is good if it's kept under control. Clearly, the rule of law preferable over the lawless mob, which what the French Revolution inspired in his writings as to how chaotic, violent that it was. Revolution, again in quotations here, is okay, according to Burke, in the sense of restoration of rights. And this also has some commonalities with John Locke that we talked about in the last chapter, is that we're not looking at revolution necessarily as overthrowing the government, but if the government's not doing what you've tasked it to do as far as providing these individual rights and property rights and rule of law, well, then it needs to be redone. Burke is looking at change through reform rather than abstract innovation that could lead to tyranny of the majority or mob rule or just protests on a whim. He has somewhat of a prejudice toward familiar habits and the latent wisdom that is within us and those the people that need to be brought to the leadership role with this latent wisdom. The features of government, according to Burke, again, with a representative form of government, but he also advocates a true natural aristocracy. We'll get into that here in just a minute, that the people that are somewhat born into this role, they need to go ahead and take that role seriously. Also, private property and distribution of power. So as you can see, there's a lot of common elements here, and we've just got different shades that are creating the major differences between ideologies. Some more features from Edmund Burke, that the representative who's being sent there to government should prefer people's interests over his own, but he does owe people his own judgment. That's why we need to send people to government that have wisdom, knowledge. He's somewhat elitist in this idea right here, is that best not to broaden the electorate until people vote responsibly. Even there, he has some commonalities with John Stuart Mill that we've already talked about, that John Stuart Mill felt that more educated people should have a little bit more voting power. Here, Burke is saying that perhaps not everyone should vote until they've demonstrated that they can vote responsibly. Neither of those would go over in today's world, but those are some common features. Now, here's where he differs quite a bit from the modern liberal side of politics, is that a hereditary aristocracy that's born into this position is going to have more leisure time in order to spend, in order to gain lots of knowledge, develop necessary abilities to govern, and the property passed down that ties attachments to this particular group of people. Now, obviously, this is part of what contributes to the inequality today, is the passing down of property. But again, we're looking at early ideas that influenced the modern conservatism as we think of it today. He also talks about the importance of the secondary associations of civil society, these volunteer groups, organizations that bring people together for political participation. This allows for a spread of power. This also, another major conservative feature, is that local concerns would be addressed at local level, and of course, a respect for the traditional authority of government. So Burke's writings were quite influential from then on. Again, with ideologies and people that purvey these ideologies, they can pick and choose what they want in order to satisfy their own personal motivations. But Burke remains quite influential on conservatism. As we get into the 1800s, we're also seeing some reactionaries that are looking to push back against some things that had occurred that literally contributed to liberalism. We're not necessarily pushing back against liberalism. We're pushing back against some of the things that inspired liberalism, which is interesting. The French Revolution was an assault on throne and altar, an assault on this traditional authority. And the reactionaries typically considered the period of enlightenment was some of an age of arrogance, striving for perfection, which is not possible among humans. Of course, that is a somewhat of a misperception of the Enlightenment. For a while there, the Enlightenment was somewhat downplayed by the conservative side of politics. A important statesman, Metternich from Austria, he was also very influential and partly responsible for restoring a hereditary monarch in the Austrian Empire. So he was looking to go back to these more traditional authoritarian forms of rule well after the Constitution had been written. The Catholic Church also counterattacked liberalism for undermining traditional order as well. As we've talked about before, the Protestant Reformation was very influential in leading up to liberalist type thinking. Another shade of conservatism that's a little bit departing from the classical traditionalists here was the cultural conservatism. Looking from the English point of view, England really didn't have much of a reason to be reactionary from the French Revolution. That was their thing. In England had its own parliament, which was very influential in the United States Congress. However, looking at the Industrial Revolution, that was more of a threat to the traditional agricultural society. So that's what they were a little bit more focused on, is that what this new creed of production, of consumerism and production that fostered crass materialism and also threatened the traditional agricultural order. That's what they were a little bit more focused on there. And then the Tory democracy evolves at this time in this period in England, where they are looking at trying to establish an alliance between the aristocratic class and the working class. The Tory side of politics still exists today, looking to address the needs of workers with respect of the traditional order. So they're trying to come to a hybrid there, best of both worlds, where we keep this respect for the traditional ruling class, but yet also trying to focus a little bit more attention on the working class as well. And as part of that compromise, Prime Minister Disraeli legalizes trade unions is in 1874. Now, moving over to the United States, again in the 1800s, where we've already talked about how this century we saw quite a significant divergence between liberalism, the classical side of liberalism, which then forms into the conservative side of politics. Adams, Hamilton, both considered conservative thinkers of that time. Adams, talking about men of property, were the ones that were responsible for voting and running the show. Hamilton was actually trying to promote a constitutional monarchy. Hamilton was very influential in our founding, but during the actual Constitutional Convention, he was not quite as participating in that. He was really trying to push the envelope to create a monarch for life that would be above politics, but he was overruled on that. As we get into the mid-1800s, this cultural conservatism that we've touched on over in England then starts to combine this futility of quest for perfection. Again, we're kind of pushing back against the Enlightenment age of men being able to rule themselves, and also with the concern for capitalism. However, the individualists start to have quite a bit of influence here that are focusing on private property with this laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire means hands off. Don't want the government to get involved in the business affairs. So here's where we start to see, particularly during the Industrial Revolution and the aftermath of that, the split with the welfare liberalism that we talked about in the last chapter, which call for government action to promote individual liberty and opportunity. So the conservatives are now splitting off and derived from the classical liberalism of individual rights, property rights, limited government, and then opposing the idea of government being more proactive and providing opportunities or removing obstacles to opportunity for people, whereas the individualist conservative side of things says that men should be responsible for that on their own. So there you can see where it's starting to diverge, and that the classical conservatives look at the defense of property with competitive individualism. As we get into the 1900s, there on the conservative side, there's a growing argument against empowering the ignorance of mass society. The conservative side of politics did not put a lot of faith in pure democracy or the wisdom of mass society at large. That's why we had to maintain this reverence for the leaders that were in that position. The fascist movements that came about in Europe, particularly, we'll look more in detail at Stalinism, fascism, that these were according to the conservative side of things, these are the logical result of democratic excesses. So we need to be careful of that in the United States to not let too much democracy get out. The leveling, now we talked about the levelers, that was a different group from a previous century, but this idea of leveling to where trying to make everyone equal to a certain extent takes away from the top and reduces everyone to somewhat of a common denominator from their perspective. And this is the enemy of social variety and diversity, is that if everybody's equal, then perhaps you might be dampening down on variety and diversity. Again, this is what makes it so complicated, and that we're still to this day trying to find the best of those. Well, the more polarized we get, the less likely that's going to happen. So that's why if we start to try to look at the other sides and try to get the best of both worlds, then you might see a little bit more progress. The Southern agrarians in the United States concerned with the roots of their society and felt threatened by the invasion of industrialization. So we have, particularly in the post-Civil War, we've got industrial North and agrarian South that's also affecting the political ideologies, much like the cultural conservatives in England. Now, I talked a little bit about how the rise of socialist ideas in the late 1800s was also influential in that divergence between the welfare liberal side of politics and the classical side of liberalism, which becomes the conservative side. And then as we get into the World War II period, particularly right off the bat in the early 1900s, when communist movements started to come up, that the conservative side of politics was very much opposed to that. We'll talk more about communism later, but the communists felt the source of social problems was not human nature, but the social conditions that were imposed on people. And the conservatives felt that this faith in progress was unwarranted. Again, pushing back against the perfectibility of human nature being unjustified, and certainly disliked the emphasis on centralized state planning, which was at the heart of communism. Now, we'll talk more about the failure of communism later on, but the rise of communism was very instrumental in kind of solidifying the conservative side of politics as that being one of their common factors that brought them together was opposition to communism, particularly here after World War II. Now, since the fall of the Soviet Union, which signified the failure of communism yet again, the differences within conservatives have increased. We'll talk about a few of those here in a little bit, but just by its general nature of the conservative mindset, there's no shortage of issues in a changing society for a conservative to find opposition with, because the world, society, humans, whatever it's influenced by, technological progress, significant events, whatever. The world is constantly changing, constantly shifting. So there's just no end to things that a conservative mindset can latch onto and say that we're opposed to that. So conservatism, shown some divisions here, again, going back to the traditional conservatism from Burke's ideas of ordered liberty, preserving a social fabric, reverence for private property. The traditional conservatives actually felt that unbridled capitalism was a threat to traditional relationships, too disruptive. So competition need to be kept within bounds. However, the individualist conservatism, which seems to have perhaps dominated as we get further into today's world, they're looking at a competitive free market, again, emphasis on property rights, and looking at it from the point of view that whatever is hindering that, civil rights, for example, could be considered an infringement of private property rights, and that the problems stem from too much government involvement, too much government interference or interaction. So the individualist side of conservatism moving a little bit more in a libertarian direction. When I showed you that flow chart at the end of the last chapter, we see a lot of that mixing and blending. Now, the neoconservative, which did not really turn into a movement per se, but particularly as we get into the 21st century, in the run-up to that, the polarized side of politics leads to these different shades here. A common theme, government making things worse, but the neoconservatives had somewhat mixed feelings on capitalism, where the individual thrift and hard work of people is central to our economy, but the increasing debt is counter to what conservative economic policy should be about. One of the common themes of conservatives perhaps has become somewhat of a trademark is lower taxes, lower taxes, lower taxes. That's a common theme that attracts people because nobody wants to pay taxes, but we also have to keep in mind that if we increase spending, how's that going to be paid for? So the neoconservative side of things are looking at these debates, still advocating strong military power. It was the neoconservative side of politics that really decided to invade Iraq, which certainly had mixed results. We might talk a little bit about that a little bit more later. We're also looking from the neoconservative side, the concern with cultural arts that could be eroding traditional values, getting into more permissive, more sexualization of less censored type of arts that could be hurting traditional values. So these are some of the things that the conservative side of politics focus on, and we're trying to look at some of these different shades of conservatism. The religious right, which came into being in the 80s, there was somewhat of a shift. The 70s were quite tumultuous as far as economic and scandals, and so the religious right started to take a little bit more active role in influencing politics. So the influence of Christianity to restore traditional values really had a movement starting in the 80s or so with the religious right, that they are not opposed to increasing government intervention if that intervention is on moral issues, such as family values, things like that, traditional values, if the government is willing to uphold those. General goal, reestablish a Christian nation, which the United States was firmly a Christian nation fairly early on, but the secularization of modern societies has come somewhat as a normal progression. The religious right is looking at resisting to pushing back against the secularizing America. The Tea Party movement has its origins particularly in the second Bush administration, when things were not going well with both of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The economy collapsed. So the Tea Party starts to move a little bit even further right, more conservative in limiting government as far as interpreting the Constitution, going back to the original ideas of interpreting the Constitution, grassroots opposition to welfare abuse, the calling out of the elites gaming of the system. So you can see where, some of these things have caught hold. And even Donald Trump had tapped into some of this, as we'll see here in a minute, a more technocratic government. And for example, Republicans such as Mitt Romney not being conservative enough. So the Tea Party movement, which does not really exist anymore, does have its remnants that you could say were somewhat a major part of Donald Trump's base. As Trump takes more of a populist approach, it's not necessarily something that he had planned or designed. He was perhaps just looking for something to tap into, and he did tap into the white male nostalgia of looking for a simpler time when white men were in charge, when things were less complicated. He united the nativist, the anti-immigration crowd, the anti-elitist, which is somewhat ironic considering how Trump himself had come from elite background. Also anti-globalization, yet free marketers. The Trump campaign had really tapped into that, and rather successfully, because he got elected president. But we've also seen just recently that they don't necessarily hold up on a nationwide basis, and could be further discrediting himself as we look back in history as to how that turned out. Trump himself was not really a Republican. He changed party affiliation 7 times just in that very short period. He was actually ran for president the first time with the Reform Party. He considered himself an independent one time, was a member of the Democratic Party 2 times, Republican Party 3 times, which enabled him to tap into this crowd up here on the Republican side with his populist ideas, and it succeeded into getting him elected president. We're at the point now, it remains to be seen as how the Trump side of conservatism is going to play out. There are still some major commonalities among the conservative side, even though they are quite divided at the moment. They're still opposed to the welfare liberalism side as well as to the social democracy side. They are still staunch advocates of peace, law and order, safety, and stability. Those are always common themes. The concept of the individual's power to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, whether it's through personal competition or part of the greater whole, they are still somewhat common on that. The concept of self-restraint, being held responsible and accountable, yet with still limited, cautious exercise of government. That's the general overview of conservatism, and I know that we tried to cover different shades of conservatism that in today's world it pretty much coalesces into the Republican Party side of politics, but this gives us a little bit more deeper appreciation for the complexity of these issues. So stay tuned for the discussion forum, and next chapter we'll be talking about socialism.